118 years ago, Portugal's 800-year-old monarchy was torn apart in just a matter of minutes. By the turn of the 20th century, Portugal's territorial ambitions in Africa had been gutted. Lisbon had declared bankruptcy twice, once in 1892 and then again in 1902. Republicanism was gaining ground, and in 1907, the Portuguese Prime Minister João Franco effectively established his own dictatorship with the monarch's support. Despite having to cut short his winter hunting retreat to deal with the worsening crisis in the capital, the Portuguese king Carlos I still insisted on travelling in an open-top carriage. The king, who had ruled for nearly 20 years by that point, was determined to present a front of normality. That morning, he squeezed into his stately blue service uniform, and his two sons were told to dress in civilian clothes. As the entourage passed through Lisbon's Square of Commerce en route to its final stop at the Royal Palace, a middle-aged man in the sparsely crowded square watched the carriage roll by before he knelt down on one knee. He pulled a semi-automatic rifle from his coat and fired straight into the back of the king's neck. Panic overtook the crowd, and the single-mounted officer escorting the carriage hardly had time to react when a second assassin joined the carnage. Here is the story of the forgotten regicide that ended the Portuguese monarchy. And this is Crown Undone. The penultimate king of Portugal was born 2 years after his father, Luís, unexpectedly ascended the Portuguese throne. Luís's brother, Pedro V, had been Portugal's king for 8 years when an outbreak of typhoid fever or cholera swept through the palace, killing Pedro and two of his brothers. After inheriting the Portuguese crown, Luís married the youngest daughter of Italy's King Victor Emmanuel II in 1862. Maria Pia gave birth to Carlos, the Prince Royal and the Duke of Braganza in 1863, and Alfonso, the Duke of Porto, was born in 1865. Carlos was put through an intensive education to prepare for his role as a constitutional monarch. He visited Italy, the UK, France, and Germany, and it was during one of these European trips that Carlos met the eldest daughter of the disputed King of the French, Princess Amélie of Orléans. Amélie's father, Prince Philippe of Orléans, was a grandson of France's King Louis Philippe, who spent 21 years in exile, returned to France to reign as king for nearly 18 years, before he abdicated at the outbreak of the 1848 French Revolution, spending his final years back in exile. Although Philippe had never been officially proclaimed king, the 8 children that he shared with his first cousin, Princess Marie Isabelle, still offered valuable marriage prospects. Carlos and Princess Amélie married in Lisbon in 1886, and their 2 surviving children, Luís and Manuel, were born in 1887 and 1889 respectively. It was just before the birth of Manuel that Carlos's father, King Luís's health rapidly deteriorated, supposedly from the effects of syphilis. The king had likely contracted the STI during one of his many alleged extramarital affairs, but the infection had remained dormant until the final years of his life, when the disease reportedly evolved into neurosyphilis. Once the 50-year-old Luís died on the 19th of October 1889, the reign of King Carlos I commenced, but it wouldn't take long for Portugal's newly crowned king to become embroiled in the first of many political crises. At the beginning of 1890, the British government under Lord Salisbury delivered an ultimatum to Portugal that demanded the withdrawal of Portuguese troops from a vast area of Africa where Britain's territorial interests overlapped with Portugal's. Amid the colonial carve-up of Africa, which was supposedly formalised by Europeans at the 1885 Berlin Conference, Portugal drew up its so-called Pink Map to depict the country's territorial claims to a land corridor that connected its colonies of Angola and Mozambique. But Britain refused to accept the land grab, insisting that Portugal had not abided by the articles agreed to at the Berlin Conference. In fact, the British consul for Mozambique, Henry E. O'Neill, said that to speak of Portuguese colonies in East Africa is to speak of a mere fiction, a fiction colourably sustained by a few scattered seaboard settlements, beyond whose narrow literal and local limits colonisation and government have no existence. Although Portugal was initially set on standing its ground, the seriousness of the British ultimatum and Britain's threat to sever diplomatic ties between the two countries made the Portuguese change tack. Fearing the outbreak of an Anglo-Portuguese war in Africa, Carlos ultimately accepted British demands. Portugal withdrew its troops and abandoned its claims to the land corridor that would have connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian. The fallout from the crisis rocked the Portuguese public's faith in their monarchy, the government resigned, republicanism was bolstered, and an attempted military coup broke out in Porto in January the next year. But any lasting animosity towards the British had to be shelved when Lisbon declared bankruptcy twice over the next 12 years, and loans had to be sought from London. In fact, diplomatic relations between the two countries seemed so repaired by 1903 that Edward VII became the first British king to travel to the country on a state visit. Australia's Western Mail reported that during the trip, Edward remarked, "I am much touched by this unprecedented mark of your attention to me on the occasion of my visit. I regard it as a national demonstration. It is with the greatest pleasure I make my first visit to Portugal since the accession to court of my dear cousin, your illustrious sovereign. I assure you, your presence and address are regarded by me as a renewed affirmation of the political alliance that has existed for centuries. I will not easily forget the heartiness of the welcome accorded me by all classes." So at least to London, the British ultimatum was now water under the bridge. The Portuguese people, on the other hand, didn't seem to share the same confidence in their own king. In 1906, Carlos appointed the monarchist João Franco as Prime Minister of Portugal to deal with the ongoing economic and social crises, but Franco's bold reforms were completely undermined by his establishment of a virtual dictatorship and accusations that he had been illegally transferring money to the king. Franco was about to enter his second year in office when he received news that the king had been shot dead. On the 1st of February 1908, Carlos, his wife Amélie, and their two sons Luís and Manuel were returning to Lisbon's royal palace after a winter hunting retreat in the country south when bullets pierced through the Square of Commerce. The schoolteacher and soldier, Manuel Buica, could hardly believe his luck when the first shot he fired struck straight into the king's neck, killing the 44-year-old instantly. The second assassin, the Republican publicist Alfredo Luís da Costa, fired twice more into the back of the dead king. Prince Luís was also mortally wounded as he attempted to confront the assailants, who, alongside an innocent bystander, were eventually shot dead by police. Queen Amélie and Manuel survived the incident and spent the rest of the devastating night under armed guard out of fear of further attempts on their lives. In just minutes, Portugal's monarchy had been torn apart, and in the wake of his father and his brother's murder, Manuel was proclaimed king. Manuel II's reign would last just 2.5 years before the nearly 800-year-old Portuguese kingdom was overthrown, forcing the king and his family to flee to England, where he died in 1932 at 42 years old, living 2 years less than his father and 22 years longer than his older brother. That was the forgotten regicide that ended the Portuguese monarchy. And this is Crown Undone.